Welcome back, friends. This is Brian at Peru Art, and in today's video we are going to do something kind of cool. We're going to use both gouache and watercolor together. Now, why in the world would we do that? Well, they both have their strengths and their weaknesses, and if you combine them, you can try to take advantage of the best of both worlds. And near the end of the video, stick around because we'll have the drawing for the rooster that I drew last week, and we'll see who that goes to. We have a really interesting way of selecting it, so you want to stick around to check that out. But first, let's take a look at gouache and watercolor and kind of discuss the differences between them and similarities. I'm going to do a couple tests here. We can see I've labeled gouache and watercolor. They are very similar. They have pigments and are water soluble, and you can adjust to some extent how much pigment you're putting down on a paper. As you'll see, the big difference between watercolor and gouache, and why you might choose one over the other, is that watercolor is fairly transparent. You can use it almost straight out of the tin or out of a little tube, and you can sometimes get it pretty opaque. And of course, you can blend these and go from dark to light using water, and that's a beautiful thing about watercolors. You can really get nice gradients, and you can do it fairly easily with a little bit of practice. So you can see I'm trying out a couple different colors over lines, so you can see that it is fairly transparent. And typically watercolors are used in thin washes. You'll do one wash of a color or a couple colors, maybe dry it down, and then add another color on top of that. Or sometimes you can do that wet. There are different methods, of course, but it is typically used in layers. You take advantage of that transparency to create other colors. This is also one of the reasons watercolors can be very challenging, because once you put watercolor down on a paper, it's hard to remove it, at least completely. You can do some correcting by using an opaque color, sort of like the one I'm putting here, an English red, one of the more opaque colors, and it can do a fairly good job at covering over things, but not completely. And of course, you're limited in the colors that you can use for that. I think most artists are somewhat familiar with watercolors. I do get questions from time to time about gouache, though. Gouache is a different beast. In some ways, you treat it like watercolors. You can get them in a tube, and depending on the type of gouache, if you have a traditional gouache, you can use water and re-wet it and reactivate it, and it'll be great. What I'm using here is an acrylic gouache. The binder, instead of being a gum arabic or something like that, is an acrylic. So in some ways it acts like acrylic paint. It is very opaque, as you can see. That white went right over the black and the gray, and you can see barely anything through that. When it is very new to the surface, sometimes you can do a little bit of gradient work with it, but that is also difficult, and one of the reasons why gouache is a challenge, because it dries very quickly. And most of the time when you're working with it, if you go from one color to another color, by the time you get to the second color, the first color is probably almost dry. So it doesn't really blend well on the paper. Typically the way gouache is used is to mix distinct colors on your palette and then apply that directly to your surface. You can do a certain amount of blending, but it tends to be a little bit challenging to do that and not very predictable. The other thing about gouache is that the color you see when it's wet will change when it dries. And that is a challenging thing for a lot of people using gouaches. It's a little bit hard to predict. You just have to kind of get used to it and be willing to make some changes down the road once you see it didn't work out quite the way you thought it would. In today's video, I'm going to be doing two different portraits. This first one I am beginning in gouache. And you can see why gouache was popular among poster artists through the years, because you can get really nice, bold, and flat colors very easily. And it also dries fast, so it's perfect for that sort of work. And as I mentioned, the traditional way of applying gouache is in kind of distinct colors, not relying on mixing colors on the paper or on the surface, because that really doesn't work very easily because it dries very fast. And I will admit, I am not very good with gouache. I'm not very handy with it, and that's part of the reason that I wanted to do this, because I wanted to practice, and I do like the style of gouache. You tend to have a very painterly sort of look, leaving distinct brush strokes and seeing each brushstroke having a different color, and that can be a really cool effect, and I'm just not good at it yet. Now, if you're used to being able to adjust your colors on the paper, on the canvas, this is a challenge because you do have to mix your colors on your palette, and you'll find after applying it, it wasn't the right color, or even worse, it's the exact right color, and then it dries and it's slightly different than what you put down. So I struggled mightily with this piece. I went over it and over it and over it with different colors, thinking this isn't quite right, mixing the colors differently, oh that's not quite right, going back and changing it, oh that's not right either. This is one of the reasons why using an acrylic gouache would be an advantage, which I'm using here. If you're using a traditional gouache and you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of paint, oftentimes what will happen is it'll start to crack. And that's really the reason I stopped using gouache. I don't think they even had acrylic gouaches back then when I was practicing with it, but now they do, and these acrylic gouaches, they hold up with many layers, so that is an advantage. The one disadvantage is once you get it out of the tube and you put it on your palette, you got to use it, because once it dries, it will be unusable after that. Traditional gouache you can re-wet, and you can store it and you can re-wet it kind of like you do with watercolors, but not with acrylic gouache. After I spent hours and hours on this painting, I told you I'm not very good with gouache, I got to the end and it was okay, but I just wasn't satisfied. The color seemed off and I wanted to change it, which is the exact reason that I started researching adding watercolor to the gouache. The part I wasn't sure about was, because this is acrylic gouache, would the watercolors actually adhere? And I wasn't willing to use something like alcohol inks because I don't trust this paper, and on the back side of this are drawings that I actually wanted to keep, things that I liked. So I decided to try it with watercolor. You see I have nice brush strokes from the gouache, but the color was just off. I needed to tone down some of the reds and work with some of the blues in the shirt there to make it a little bit less distinct. So what I did is I mixed up some watercolor. To tone down the red, I wanted to use some green, just color theory there, get it to be a little bit more of a neutral color. I warmed up the green a little bit with some cadmium red light to make it not quite a bright green. Full disclosure, I had already done some of this wash prior to this. I missed some of the video. I don't know how that happened, but I wanted to show you the basic thing that I was doing. Kind of toning down the colors by using is complementary opposite is one way that you can apply watercolors on top of the gouache to kind of adjust the overall tint without having to repaint the entire thing. I think you'd have a very hard time doing a wash with gouache colors, but this works out really fantastic with watercolors. And I was surprised at how well this worked. Everything adhered just fine, and it was able to just tone it down enough that it's like, oh, that looks more like a skin tone as opposed to some sunburnt crab on the beach. And I would imagine if you're using traditional gouache, this would work just as well, or probably better. I believe that it would probably be a little bit more absorbent without the acrylic added to as a binder. But overall, I was really pleased with how I could adjust this gouache portrait to make it a little bit more to my liking. You know, because gouache is opaque, if I wanted to change these colors, I'd pretty much have to redo the entire thing. So this is a nice way to add some adjustments without going through that whole process. In the end, this wasn't one of my favorites, but I think it was acceptable and made a lot better with those watercolors. You can see the nice brush strokes, kind of a painterly look, and that's what I was after. I'm going to take a little break from the painting to introduce you to the method of selecting a winner from last week's drawing for the drawing of the rooster. I could have done this the normal way and just put everything in a hat and picked one, but you know, what fun is that? This is a creative channel, so I'm going to let nature decide. So I put out these bricks, and there were 8 entries from last week, and I put their names all on these cards, which I'm going to place out here. And in order to have a squirrel decide a winner, I'm going to place a tempting peanut on each one. So when the squirrel picks one of those peanuts up, the first one that he picks, that will also be the winner of the rooster drawing and the ruling pen. So we'll be looking forward to that as the video goes on. But you know what? Let's get back to the art. The second portrait, I decided I was going to go backwards from the first one. I would do a watercolor painting and then make adjustments to that using gouache. Techniques for painting, including watercolor, are as varied as there are artists. But I'm using a pretty traditional technique on this one. It's similar to a grisaille, which would be like an underpainting in kind of muted or neutral colors. But I'm using blue and then darkening that a little bit later, as you see here, with a little bit of ultramarine, and that will kind of be my base layer to start out with. This will help to establish some of the tonal values throughout the painting and kind of establish where the lights and the darks are. And after this blue phase, I'm going to warm it up with a little bit of red, generally some cadmium red light, maybe some orange, perhaps some quinacridone. This will just help the colors approach more of a skin-like tone, but this is going to be a long process of adding many thin layers. This isn't really meant to be a full tutorial on how to do watercolor. I may do one later. But in general, what I will do is just kind of push and pull with the colors Where things are too cool, I'll try to warm them up. And where they're too warm, I'll cool them down with something on the cooler side. And then there are times when you need to do some corrections and where you need to get dark. So using certain colors like violet, umber, or some of these colors that are a little bit more opaque, English red, you're able to correct some things, achieve darker colors quicker, and you'll end up eventually with something hopefully you're pretty close to liking. This portrait took me a long time. I had to make a lot of corrections. Some things just weren't working out. But overall, I thought that the watercolor itself was fine, but it needed a little bit of definition. I needed to make a couple corrections that I couldn't do with watercolor. So I thought, what a great time to introduce some gouache. So we'll remember that gouache has some strengths and some weaknesses. And one of the strengths is it is opaque, and you can paint over things. For instance, you can go over dark things and make them lighter, which you can't do with watercolor. So you can see I'm defining the eye, particularly the areas that need to be a little bit lighter to pop out those lashes and the lid. And this just makes the eyes pop, which worked out really, really well. You'll see there are some other areas that just needed some touching up, things that, again, I couldn't accomplish with watercolors, but are fairly easy to do with gouache, with something that is opaque. I wasn't crazy about the skin tone, and one thing that I ended up doing was applying some gouache in some areas and then reapplying some watercolor on top of that. So kind of went back and forth a little bit using both methods, and it ended up looking pretty good at the end. And I know that is going to hurt the soul of some people who are traditionalists and using just one method throughout, but I'm not that way. I like to experiment and try different things, and I'm just more concerned about the result. This is one of the main reasons I wanted to do gouache, to do the little bit of jewelry here. It's fine details, lighter than the rest of the subject in that area. So this was really easy to do with gouache and would have been impossible with watercolor without maybe using some masking fluid and having the foresight to do that before you started. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing a portrait particularly is to determine what the star of the show is. What is it that is compelling about this drawing or the subject? And in this case, I thought it was the eyes, and it often is. I mean, as humans, we're very drawn to eyes. So adding the little highlights to the eyes and then working on the iris here, I think is really worthwhile just to make those eyes stand out. I worked on a few other things with gouache, added some highlights to the hair. You'll see that this, I make it look not quite real, and I had to go and correct that later. But this is one thing that I wanted to do, is to make the clothes more painterly, kind of loose, getting the idea across, but I wanted that to look more like, like an oil paint. And actually the gouache worked out really well. You can see the brush strokes, and I think that it did a great job at mimicking the oil look in this case. I finished this painting with adjusting the background. I thought it needed to be a little bit darker, and I think that worked out just fine. Used a combination of some ochres and some reds, and that worked out okay. And overall, I think I'm pretty pleased with the results, and that's a good thing to try, watercolor and gouache. But how can we be concerned with gouache when there are squirrels to be concerned with? This is Ivan, the intrepid one. And he takes one! Woo! So we'll need to remember it's the middle one in the back, and we'll find out who won this one. There's Ivan enjoying the fruits of his labor, and this has been officiated by Caleb, the bunny rabbit. Ivan is always interested and curious. He's a regular in my yard, and so he definitely wants all the peanuts he can get. He will come back, and actually he eventually got all of these during the day. So congratulations, Ivan, and congratulations to Senol AA, or perhaps that's AA. That is a good Scrabble word, AA. It is a type of lava. I'm glad that the drawing is going to somebody who's been a subscriber for a while. That worked out nicely. We'll be in contact, and I will send you the drawing of the rooster and a ruling pen. And thank everybody for checking out the video today. I hope you enjoyed the watercolor and gouache paintings today. And as always, I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. And stop in next week for another video. And in the meantime, please hit subscribe and maybe notifications, or leave a comment. I really enjoy those. And we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.